Most people believe that if someone commits murder, the truth eventually reveals itself almost immediately. A witness comes forward, a security camera captures the moment, a weapon is recovered, or investigators discover something so obvious that the mystery disappears within days. But some cases don't follow that path. Sometimes a death is explained so quickly that very few people stop to question what really happened. Years pass. Families grieve. Friends slowly learn to live with the loss. The world moves on. Then, almost without warning, the case returns, and everything everyone thought they knew begins to fall apart. This is one of those stories. It begins on a peaceful stretch of coastline where visitors gathered every day to admire breathtaking ocean views. The cliffs overlook crashing waves hundreds of feet below. Tourists smiled for photographs. Couples held hands as they walked the trails. Families pointed toward the horizon while children chased each other along the lookout paths. It was the last place anyone expected to become the center of a homicide investigation. One afternoon, emergency services received a report that a woman had fallen from one of those cliffs. When first responders arrived, there was little they could do. The fall had been fatal. To everyone standing nearby, it appeared to be a heartbreaking accident, but years later, investigators would reach a very different conclusion. They would accuse the woman's own husband, a former pastor, of intentionally pushing her to her death before those allegations could ever be tested inside a courtroom. Another tragedy unfolded. The accused man was found dead in his jail cell, leaving behind a handwritten note and a criminal case that would never reach trial. What really happened on that cliff? Was it a tragic accident that investigators later misunderstood? Or did detectives uncover evidence suggesting something far more sinister? Because the case never went before a jury, some questions remain unanswered to this day. Before we begin, if you enjoy carefully researched true crime documentaries that separate verified facts from speculation, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps us continue bringing you stories where the truth isn't always as simple as it first appears. Long before investigators accused David Vander Meer of murder, he was known in a very different way. People who met him didn't know him as a criminal suspect. They knew him as a pastor. For years, he held a position built on trust. His work placed him in front of congregations where honesty, compassion, forgiveness, and integrity were values he encouraged others to follow. To many people, he projected calmness and stability. That public image would later become one of the reasons the case attracted such widespread attention. His wife, Bernadette Vander Meer, shared much of her life with him away from the spotlight. Like countless married couples, they experienced ordinary routines that few outsiders ever noticed. Friends saw photographs. Family members watched birthdays pass. Holiday gatherings came and went. From a distance, nothing suggested their marriage would one day become the focus of a years-long criminal investigation. As investigators would later explain, however, appearances do not always tell the full story. According to authorities, evidence collected over time suggested that the marriage may have been experiencing significant difficulties before Bernadette's death. Public reporting later indicated that detectives examined allegations involving financial pressures and David's relationship with another woman. Those details did not prove that a crime had occurred. Investigators treated them as possible pieces of a much larger puzzle. Like detectives in every major homicide investigation, they understood that motive alone is never enough. People experience financial problems every day. Relationships fail every day. Affairs, while painful, do not automatically lead to violence. If they intended to accuse someone of murder, they would need far more than circumstances that merely appeared suspicious. At the time Bernadette died, however, those questions were not yet at the center of the investigation. Everything changed during what was supposed to be an ordinary trip. The couple traveled to a scenic coastal location famous for its dramatic cliffs and panoramic ocean views. Visitors described the area as peaceful. Photographers regularly visited at sunrise and sunset. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks below echoed across the cliffs, creating the kind of scenery people remembered long after they returned home. It was the perfect destination for couples looking to spend time together. No one standing nearby could have imagined that before the day was over, emergency responders would be rushing toward the same location. According to David's account at the time, Bernadette accidentally fell from the cliff. The incident shocked everyone who heard about it. Accidental falls at scenic overlooks, while uncommon, do happen. Steep terrain, uneven ground, changing weather, and a single misstep can sometimes lead to devastating consequences. For investigators arriving at the scene, there was nothing immediately obvious to contradict that possibility. Bernadette had suffered fatal injuries consistent with a catastrophic fall. There were no immediate signs that transformed the scene into an obvious homicide investigation. As a result, Many people believed the tragedy had reached its painful conclusion. Bernadette's family mourned. Friends gathered to remember her life. The community expressed sympathy for a husband who, from the outside, appeared to have experienced an unimaginable loss. Cases like this often fade quietly into memory. This one didn't, although life continued for everyone involved. Investigators continued examining what had happened. Sometimes at a standard procedure, sometimes new information arrives after the initial investigation. Sometimes witnesses remember details differently once the shock begins to fade. Sometimes technology improves. And occasionally, a single overlooked detail changes everything. No one realized that years later, detectives would revisit that day with an entirely different perspective. The accident that many believed had already been explained was about to become the beginning of a murder investigation. At first, the renewed investigation attracted very little public attention. Cold case reviews happen more often than many people realize. Detectives routinely revisit older files when new information becomes available, when forensic methods improve, or when investigators believe earlier conclusions deserve another look. Most of those reviews lead nowhere. This one didn't. As detectives reopened the file, they began comparing every available piece of information from the original investigation with evidence collected years later. They revisited photographs from the scene. They reviewed reports prepared by first responders. They re-examined witness statements, looking for inconsistencies that may have seemed insignificant during the chaos immediately following Bernadette's death. They also reconstructed the timeline leading up to the trip. Investigators wanted to understand not only what happened at the cliff, but everything that happened before the couple ever arrived there. According to later court filings and public reporting, detectives believed the answers could not be found by looking at a single moment in isolation. Instead, they focused on the weeks and months leading up to Bernadette's death. Every financial record. Every communication, every documented movement, every interview, like assembling thousands of tiny puzzle pieces. Investigators slowly built a picture they believed differed sharply from the original conclusion. One area that reportedly drew particular attention involved finances. Life insurance exists to protect families after unexpected loss. Every year, countless spouses receive those benefits following genuine accidents or illnesses. Receiving life insurance money is not evidence of wrongdoing. Investigators understood that. Still, according to prosecutors, the financial circumstances surrounding Bernadette's death became one factor they believed deserved closer examination. Detectives reportedly reviewed insurance documents alongside other evidence, asking whether financial gain could have provided a possible motive if the death had not been accidental. Money by itself could never answer that question, but investigators believed it was one piece among many. Another area of interest involved David's personal life. Public reporting later indicated that detectives investigated allegations of an extramarital relationship. Again, investigators did not treat the allegation as proof of murder. Relationships are complicated, and infidelity, while deeply painful, does not make someone a killer. Instead, detectives examined whether the alleged relationship fit into a broader pattern they believed was emerging from the evidence. The investigation became increasingly methodical. Detectives interviewed people who had known the couple. Some conversations confirmed information already in the case file. Others reportedly introduced details that investigators believed warranted further scrutiny. Human memory is imperfect. People remember events differently. Some details become clearer with time, while others fade. Experienced investigators understand that no single witness tells the entire story. Instead, they compare independent accounts, searching for places where multiple sources unexpectedly aligned. As the review continued, prosecutors eventually concluded they had sufficient evidence to move forward. That decision did not mean guilt had been established. It meant investigators believed they had reached the legal threshold necessary to file criminal charges and present their evidence before a court. For Bernadette's loved ones, the development came after years of uncertainty. Imagine spending years believing a tragic accident had taken someone you loved, only to learn that authorities now believe the death may have been intentional. The emotional impact is difficult to measure. Grief itself is overwhelming. Adding doubt to the circumstances surrounding that loss can reopen wounds many families have spent years trying to heal. When news finally broke that David Vander Meer had been arrested, the reaction was immediate. Headlines spread quickly. The words "former pastor" appeared beside murder charge, creating a contrast that drew national attention. Many people who had known him struggled to reconcile the allegations with the man they remembered. Some expressed disbelief. Others wondered whether investigators had uncovered evidence hidden from public view for years. The arrest marked the beginning of what many expected would become a closely watched criminal trial. Prosecutors prepared to present their case. Defense attorneys prepared to challenge it. That is how the justice system is designed to work. Arrest begins the legal process. It does not end it. Every allegation must be tested. Every witness may be questioned. Every piece of evidence can be challenged. Jurors, not investigators, reporters, or the public ultimately decide whether the prosecution has proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That opportunity was approaching. David denied the allegations against him, like every defendant charged with a crime. He was entitled to the presumption of innocence unless and until proven guilty in court. His first court appearance was scheduled. Behind the scenes, prosecutors continued organizing evidence they expected to present. Witnesses prepared for the possibility of testifying. Bernadette's family waited, hoping that after years of unanswered questions, they might finally hear the complete case laid out in open court. No one could have predicted what would happen next. Just days after the arrest, before opening statements, before cross-examinations, before a single juror could hear the evidence, everything changed. Inside the jail where David was being held, correctional staff made a discovery that instantly brought the criminal proceedings to a halt. The investigation that had taken years to build was suddenly facing a completely different and unexpected ending. The news spread through law enforcement circles before it reached the public. David Vander Meer had been found unresponsive inside his jail cell. Correctional officers immediately called for medical assistance, and emergency personnel attempted life-saving measures. Despite those efforts, he was pronounced dead. Authorities later announced that his death had been ruled a suicide. According to public reports, investigators also recovered a handwritten note from the cell. Officials confirmed the note existed, but they released very little about its contents. That decision immediately fueled speculation. People wanted to know whether the note addressed the allegations. Did it explain what happened on the cliff? Did it express remorse? Did it maintain his innocence? Or was it focused entirely on something else? Those questions spread rapidly across news reports and online discussions. But speculation is not evidence, because the contents of the note were never fully disclosed to the public. No responsible conclusion can be drawn about what it did or did not say. In many high-profile cases, the absence of information often creates more theories than the available facts ever could. This case quickly became one of them. For prosecutors, the consequences were immediate. Without a living defendant, the criminal case could not proceed. The trial that investigators had spent years preparing would never begin. The courtroom where evidence was supposed to be examined would remain silent. Witnesses who had prepared to testify would never take the stand. Experts who had analyzed evidence would never explain their findings before a jury. Defense attorneys would never have the opportunity to challenge the prosecution's conclusions. Everything stopped. From a legal standpoint, the case had reached an unusual ending. David had been charged, but he had never been convicted. He had denied the allegations against him. And because he died before trial, no court ever determined whether the prosecution's case met the legal standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That distinction is essential. True crime stories can easily blur the line between accusation and conviction. Responsible reporting requires treating those two things very differently. Investigators believed they had uncovered evidence supporting a murder charge. A conviction, however, never occurred. The criminal justice system was deprived of the opportunity to complete its work. For Bernadette's family, that reality carried a different kind of pain. The arrest had offered the possibility that years of uncertainty might finally lead to answers. Instead, they were left with another devastating loss and another unanswered chapter. Many families describe a criminal trial as more than a legal proceeding. It is often the first time every piece of evidence is presented in one place. Witnesses speak publicly. Experts explain their conclusions. Questions are asked under oath, even when the outcome is difficult to accept. Families often say the process itself provides a clearer understanding of what investigators believe happened. In this case, that process never took place. The public saw only fragments. Court filings. News conferences. Official statements. None of those could replace a full trial. Detectives, too, faced an abrupt ending. Imagine dedicating years to reviewing thousands of pages of documents, interviewing witnesses, reconstructing timelines, and preparing evidence for court. Every investigation demands patience. Every major decision requires careful review. After finally reaching the point where charges are filed, the expectation is that the evidence will be tested before a jury. That opportunity disappeared overnight. Although investigators publicly stood by their decision to bring charges, they would never know how a jury might have evaluated the case. Would jurors have found the evidence convincing beyond a reasonable doubt? would the defense have introduced explanations that created reasonable doubt? Those questions can no longer be answered. The legal process exists precisely because complex cases deserve careful examination from both sides. Without that examination, certainty becomes much harder to achieve. As reporters continued covering the story, another question emerged. Why had it taken so many years for investigators to file charges? The answer is more complicated than many people realize. Contrary to what television dramas often suggest, homicide investigations do not always move quickly. Some cases are solved within hours. Others require months, and some remain active for years while detectives quietly collect additional evidence. Investigators may wait for new forensic techniques. They may continue interviewing witnesses as memories evolve. They may discover documents that were unavailable during the original investigation. Or they may receive information from someone who finally decides to come forward after remaining silent for years. Publicly, authorities have not disclosed every factor that led to the timing of the arrest. What is clear is that detectives believed they had gathered enough evidence to support criminal charges after conducting a lengthy investigation. Whether that evidence would ultimately have persuaded 12 jurors is something history will never reveal. That uncertainty has become one of the defining features of this case. Instead of ending with a verdict, it ended with a question mark for many people. That is exactly why the story remains so compelling. Not because every mystery has been solved, but because one of the most important chapters was never written. As the initial wave of headlines began to fade, the case entered a different stage. The breaking news was over. Television crews packed up their equipment. Reporters moved on to newer stories. But for the people whose lives had been permanently changed, nothing had truly ended. Bernadette's family still woke each morning knowing she was gone. Friends still remembered birthdays she would never celebrate. The passage of time did not reduce the weight of those memories. If anything, the sudden end of the criminal case made the loss feel even more complicated. Many people assume that every homicide investigation concludes with a verdict. In reality, some cases never reach that point. Witnesses die. Evidence disappears. Suspects are never identified. Or, as happened here, the person accused of the crime dies before the legal process can run its course. When that happens, families are often left carrying two separate burdens. The first is grief. The second is uncertainty. Grief slowly changes over time. Uncertainty has a way of remaining exactly as it was. For detectives, uncertainty is something they spend entire careers trying to eliminate. Every unanswered question becomes another lead to examine. Every inconsistency becomes another report to review. Every overlooked detail deserves another look. According to public statements, investigators believed they had reached their conclusion after years of careful work. They stood by the decision to charge David Vander Meer, but standing by an investigation is different from proving it in court. That difference remained impossible to ignore. Outside the courtroom, public opinion began forming almost immediately. Some people believed the investigation had finally uncovered the truth after years of persistence. Others questioned whether the evidence would have survived the scrutiny of a criminal trial. Neither opinion could change one important reality. No jury ever heard the complete case. No verdict was ever returned. The legal system simply stopped where it was. That is one reason responsible true crime reporting matters. Stories involving real people can easily become distorted when speculation replaces documented facts. It is tempting to fill every unanswered question with theories. Social media often rewards certainty, even when certainty does not exist. Investigations, however, demand something different. They demand patience. They demand evidence, and sometimes they require accepting that not every question can be answered. The cliff where Bernadette died eventually returned to its ordinary rhythm. Tourists continued arriving, photographs were taken, the ocean continued crashing against the rocks below exactly as it had long before that tragic day. To visitors unfamiliar with the case, it remained a place of remarkable beauty. To those who knew Bernadette's story, however, the location carried an entirely different meaning. It became forever connected to unanswered questions. Places often absorb history in ways that are invisible. Someone standing at the overlook today might never realize that investigators once spent countless hours examining that very location, measuring distances, reviewing photographs, comparing statements, trying to determine whether a single moment had been an accident or an intentional act. Those efforts unfolded quietly, far away from television cameras. Most major investigations do. The public usually sees only the arrest. What they rarely see are the thousands of hours leading up to it. Detectives reading reports late into the night. Investigators conducting interviews that produce only small pieces of information. Prosecutors reviewing evidence again and again before deciding whether criminal charges are appropriate. Every major case is built through countless ordinary moments of careful work. Sometimes that work results in a conviction, sometimes it results in an acquittal, and occasionally, as in this case, it results in neither. One detail continued attracting public attention more than almost any other. David's role as a former pastor. Positions of spiritual leadership carry enormous responsibility. Communities often place deep trust in those who hold them. When someone in that position becomes the subject of serious criminal allegations, the emotional reaction extends beyond the individuals directly involved. People naturally begin asking difficult questions. Did anyone notice warning signs? Could anything have been prevented? Were there private struggles hidden behind a public image of stability? Those questions appear after many high-profile cases. Sometimes clear answers emerge. Sometimes they do not. Public records in this case do not provide complete answers to every one of those questions. What they do show is that investigators believe the evidence they gathered justified bringing the matter before a court. History prevented that process from taking place. That unfinished legal chapter continues to shape how the case is remembered. Years from now, people may forget specific dates. They may forget individual headlines, but they are likely to remember the unusual way this story ended. Not with 12 jurors filing into a courtroom. Not with a judge reading a sentence, but with a jail cell, a handwritten note, and a trial that never happened. For many families affected by violent crime, closure is a word that feels almost impossible to define. Some find peace after a conviction. Others continue asking questions, even after the legal system has reached its conclusion. In Bernadette's case, closure meant confronting the reality that the justice process would remain incomplete forever. That may be the hardest part of this entire story, not simply the tragedy itself, but the fact that the final opportunity to examine every allegation in open court disappeared before it ever began. Cases like this often leave investigators with a question they can never fully answer, not whether they believed they had identified the right suspect, but whether the evidence they spent years collecting would have persuaded 12 ordinary citizens sitting together inside a courtroom. That is the purpose of a trial. It is where assumptions are challenged. It is where expert opinions are questioned. It is where witnesses must answer difficult questions under oath. It is where evidence is examined from every possible angle before a verdict is reached. In this investigation, that process never took place. Instead, the evidence remained largely inside investigative files, affidavits, and court documents that the public could only partially see. For many people following the story, that created an uncomfortable tension. On one hand were investigators, who publicly stated they believed Bernadette's death was a homicide. On the other hand was the legal reality that David Vander Meer died before those allegations could ever be tested in court. Those two facts exist side by side, neither cancels out the other. That is why this case continues to generate discussion. It resists simple conclusions. True crime often encourages viewers to search for certainty. We naturally want a clear ending. We want to know exactly what happened. We want justice to arrive in a way that feels complete. Real life rarely follows that script. Sometimes investigations uncover enough evidence to support charges but never reach a verdict. Sometimes new evidence appears decades later. Sometimes a witness finally speaks after years of silence. And sometimes, despite everyone's efforts, the final chapter remains unwritten. Bernadette's story reminds us that justice is not always measured only by convictions. There is also value in careful investigation. There is value in refusing to accept easy answers simply because time has passed. The detectives who revisited this case demonstrated that an investigation does not necessarily end when headlines disappear. Years after many believed the matter had been settled, they continued asking difficult questions. They revisited evidence. They challenged assumptions. They searched for details that may have been overlooked. Whether or not a trial ultimately occurred, that persistence reflected the commitment investigators often bring to unresolved cases. The public rarely sees that side of police work. Television dramas compress years of investigation to a single hour. Real investigations move much more slowly. Detectives wait for laboratory results. They compare reports. They review interviews again and again. They consult specialists. They revisit crime scenes. Sometimes progress comes from a single overlooked detail. Sometimes it comes from advances in forensic science. And sometimes it comes from one person finally deciding they can no longer remain silent. Whatever ultimately led investigators to reopen Bernadette's case, they believed the evidence justified taking one of the most significant steps available to them, filing a murder charge. That decision forever changed how the public viewed what had once appeared to be a tragic accident. Yet the story also serves as a reminder of another important principle. being charged with a crime is not the same as being convicted. Every defendant is entitled to challenge the evidence against them. Every prosecution carries the burden of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Because David died before trial, that legal process was never completed. As a result, the criminal allegations remain exactly that, allegations that were never adjudicated in court. Recognizing that distinction does not diminish Bernadette's life, nor does it diminish the years investigators devoted to the case. Instead, it reflects an important commitment to accuracy. Responsible storytelling requires acknowledging both what is known and what remains unresolved. Perhaps that is why Bernadette's case continues to resonate with so many people. It is not simply a story about one tragic death. It is also a story about time. About how years can pass before questions begin to receive attention. About how appearances can sometimes conceal deeper problems, and about how the legal system, despite its best efforts, cannot always provide the answers people hope to receive. For Bernadette's loved ones, no investigation could restore what was taken from them. No courtroom proceeding could bring her back. The greatest loss in this story will always be a life that ended far too soon. Everything that followed the investigation, the arrest, the public attention, and the unexpected death of the accused came only after that irreversible tragedy had already occurred. Perhaps that is the detail most worth remembering. Behind every case file is a real person. Behind every headline is a family whose lives change forever. Long after the cameras leave and public attention shifts elsewhere, those families continue living with the consequences every single day. For them, this was never just another true crime story. It was their life, and it is that human reality, more than any unanswered question, that continues to give this case its lasting impact. In the years ahead, new true crime cases will inevitably capture public attention. Headlines will appear, investigations will begin, courtrooms will fill, and another story will take the place of this one in the daily news cycle. But some investigations leave a lasting impression. Not because every question was answered, but because the answers stopped just short of where people expected them to end. Bernadette Vander Meer's case is one of those investigations. It began with what many believe was a tragic accident. It evolved into a years-long homicide investigation. It led to the arrest of her husband, David Vander Meer, after investigators concluded they had enough evidence to charge him with murder. Then, before that evidence could ever be examined in a courtroom, the case came to an abrupt end with David's death in custody. Those are the broad facts that can be established from public records. Everything else must be viewed with appropriate caution. It can be tempting to look at and rest and assume the outcome is already known. History has shown us why that approach can be dangerous. There have been cases where defendants were later acquitted, others where convictions were overturned years later because of newly discovered evidence, and there have been investigations where the person originally suspected was eventually proven to be innocent. That is precisely why the courtroom matters. It exists to separate allegations from proof. In this investigation, that process never reached its conclusion. For some people, investigators' decision to file charges will always carry significant weight. For others, the absence of a completed trial will always leave room for doubt. Reasonable people may view those circumstances differently. What cannot be disputed is that Bernadette lost her life, and her family was forced to endure years of grief, followed by years of uncertainty. That reality deserves to remain at the center of the story. True crime documentaries often spend so much time focusing on suspects that victims gradually disappear into the background. Bernadette should not be remembered only for the way she died. She was a daughter. She was a family member. She was someone whose absence created an empty place in the lives of people who loved her. Long before this case became national news, she was simply living her life like millions of other people, never imagining that her name would one day appear in headlines across the country. There is another lesson hidden inside this investigation. Sometimes, the most important work detectives do happens long after the public has stopped paying attention. Reopening old files requires patience. Questioning previous conclusions requires courage. Following evidence wherever it leads often means revisiting painful events that many people assumed had already been settled. Whether those efforts ultimately lead to convictions or not, they reflect an important commitment to seeking the truth. That commitment deserves recognition. At the same time, this case also reminds us why fairness matters. Investigators have a duty to pursue evidence. Prosecutors have a duty to present their case. Defense attorneys have a duty to challenge it. Judges have a duty to ensure the process remains fair. Jurors have a duty to weigh the evidence without prejudice. Each part of that system exists for a reason. When one part is missing, especially the trial itself, complete certainty often becomes impossible. Perhaps that is why this case continues to be discussed today. Not because it offers easy answers, but because it forces us to confront difficult questions. How should we think about serious allegations that were never tested before a jury? Can a family ever truly find peace when the legal process ends before reaching a verdict? And how do we balance respect for investigators' work with the legal principle that accusations alone do not establish guilt? Those questions may never receive universal answers. Even so, they remain worth asking. They remind us that justice is more than a headline. It is a process. Sometimes that process reaches a conclusion, sometimes it doesn't. In Bernadette's case, the final legal chapter was never written. Instead, history preserved a story filled with both documented facts and unanswered questions. For those who study criminal investigations, it serves as a reminder that appearances can be deceptive. For families affected by violent crime, it illustrates how painful uncertainty can become. And for all of us, it demonstrates the importance of allowing evidence, not assumptions, to guide our understanding of events. As you leave this story behind, perhaps the most lasting image is not the cliff overlooking the ocean or the jail cell where the case unexpectedly ended. Perhaps it is the idea that truth is sometimes far more complicated than it first appears. Behind every investigation are real lives, real families, and real consequences that continue long after the cameras stop recording. If Bernadette's story teaches us anything, it is that seeking the truth requires patience, humility, and a willingness to accept that some mysteries remain unresolved, not because people stopped searching, but because circumstances prevented the search from reaching its final destination. Thank you for spending this time with us, and for approaching this case with an open mind. If you found this documentary thoughtful and balanced, consider sharing it with someone who appreciates carefully researched true crime. Your support helps this channel continue exploring complex cases with respect for both the victims and the facts. Until next time, remember that the most haunting investigations are not always the ones with the darkest crimes. Sometimes, they're the ones that never receive their final verdict.